So welcome, everyone. My name's Matt Lewis. I've got the privilege of being an AWS hero and an AWS ambassador. I work over in the UK for IBM, working on all things AWS. Absolutely delighted to be here today to talk around Amazon Q Developer, and in particular focusing on areas of sort of boosting productivity. So this is all looking at Q Developer within the IDE, and we've got a pretty packed agenda. It's going to be quite fast-paced. So my plan is to try and show as many different features and capabilities and different ways of using Q Developer over the course of the session. And the hope is that by the time you leave, you'll have a much better understanding of some of these capabilities, and hopefully you'll feel a little bit inspired to go away and actually try it out for yourself. And the great news from my perspective is if you do want to try it out, and everything that we're going to see and all the little demos that we're going to run through over the course of this session, you can try it out for yourself for free with Amazon Q Developer by signing up with an Amazon Builder ID. So there isn't a barrier to entry in terms of cost. So I want to start off at a high level around AI coding assistance. I was just hoping trying to get a show of hands in terms of who here in the audience is a regular user of an AI coding assistant. So that, it doesn't have to be Q Developer, it could be Copilot, could be Cursor. Okay. And for those, put your hand up again if you think that it is boosting your productivity, but keep your hand down if you're a little bit undecided. Okay, so what we probably have maybe like 40, 50% of regular users, slightly less are getting the productivity that they want from that. And so I want to start off with a quote that came from Gartner in a press release a few months ago, and this is coming out of their research and their surveys and studies. And they found that, or their prediction is that by 2028, 75% of all enterprise software engineers will use AI code assistance. And if you think that it was sort of 10% last year, it's kind of like an exponential growth in terms of the take-up. And I imagine, this is enterprise software engineers. If you start looking at sort of startup, smaller organizations, that number's inevitably going to be bigger. So the take-home for me from this is that if you're not already using an AI coding assistant, or at least as a minimum looking at how you can adopt and integrate an AI coding assistant into your existing developer lifecycle, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage to your competitors, because they inevitably are. And then I also really like this quote, which is from an article from the martinfarrow.com website. And this was talking about the role of AI coding assistants and essentially saying that we cannot use them with the same expectations we have for regular software. And that's because when we deal with regular software, it's deterministic. So if we pass in a value, we expect to get a certain value back. And we all know that when it comes to AI coding assistants, it's all based on generative AI and underlying large language models, foundation models, which are non-deterministic by nature. So that means if we take the example of asking to generate some code, we can pass in a prompt asking to generate a particular function. The code that it generates may compile and run, but it may not follow the coding standards that we have within an organization, or it may be suboptimal and may not perform, or even worse, it may contain vulnerabilities. So even though it generates code, you end up with this sort of levels of correctness of that code. And the way that I like to look at AI coding assistance is sort of seeing that it isn't a black box that you blindly expect it to generate something that's 100% accurate, but treating it as a tool that you work with that will accelerate you along that journey to reaching the completion of a requirement. And the fact that the AI coding assistant can get you 60, 70, 80% along the way means it's incredibly useful, means you can deliver things cheaper and quicker. And then now trying to do a positioning of Q Developer. So in this chart, I try to break down tasks that you can carry out on two axes. So the vertical axis is around context. And what we mean by this is the input context. So things with a low context essentially means that when you select a single line of code, it could be a function or a method, it could be a class or even an entire file. When we start talking about high context, that's when we want something to operate across multiple files or even the entire project structure. And then the horizontal axis is around complexity. So this is the complexity of the task that you're looking to accomplish. So when we look at things like chat, that's very good for simple tasks. But as soon as we want to carry out anything that's complex, multi-step, then we enter the world of agents. And obviously, as of yesterday morning, for those that saw the Matt Garman keynote, there are now 5 agents available within QDeveloper. So it's very clear that agents is the way that things are going. So we have an agent to generate code, to generate unit tests, to carry out code review, to generate documentation, and for code transformation. So just quickly running through in case people aren't familiar with QDeveloper, this shows the chat window. So the chat window is in the top left, and you can use it for all kinds of things. So I typically use it asking architectural questions, so it can kind of act as your AWS solution architect in the IDE. You can ask it to generate some simple code, translate code from one language to another, but essentially it's carried out in a single shot. So you pass in a prompt, you enter, it runs the inference, comes back and returns it. In the last month or two, inline chat was released. And this is actually really good in terms of, it's much more intuitive in terms of interacting with your code within the IDE. So it allows you to chat directly. And this is good. So, the way I tend to use it is selecting snippets of code, doing Command-I on a Mac, and then entering the prompt. And the reason this is good if you want to optimize code or add a new feature or change in some way is that it actually generates a diff in line, and then you can choose to accept or reject that diff. And this is a big improvement, because if you wanted to use just the chat window to do that, any code that got generated, you then need to copy and paste it across into the file. So this is a much more intuitive way to interact with your code. There's also a special context called @workspace, which is now available. So when you include @workspace in your prompt, QDeveloper works by ingesting and indexing all of your code files, the configurations, the entire project structure. So this then, when you work in the chat, it gives you a comprehensive context across your entire application within the IDE. So this is great at trying to gain an understanding of the project as a whole. And finally, we enter the world of agents. So this is a quote from Forbes, which I like, because when it starts talking about agentic AI, it says it refers to artificial intelligence systems that possess a degree of autonomy and can act on their own to achieve specific goals. And this is exactly what the agents do in QDeveloper. So you can set them a task, whether it's generating a feature of code, whether it's transforming some code, and they then act with autonomy in terms of they generate an implementation plan, they look for how they can achieve that goal. And because they're trained for a specific task, they actually don't just run inference on a single foundation model, but they actually use multiple different foundation models. They use custom models, and they can use RAG. And all of that gives you a much more richer, accurate response than is available just using the chat window. So then I was going to start, rather than looking at code generation, which people often think about when they think about coding assistants, starting with code understanding. I think part of that is my background was coming as a software engineer that has spent many years supporting applications. And all too often, it was supporting applications that I come across, whether it's a new organization or it's a new application, that it's an unfamiliar code base, I don't really understand, and all too often, the documentation doesn't actually match what's deployed in production. So in order to run this, and if people want to do it, I basically cloned a sample application from GitHub. This has a back-end and front-end packages, a back-end and front-end components, and implements a knowledge base for Bedrock. But what I ended up doing was deleting the README file. So this was just an attempt at doing a demo where when we come in, we don't actually know anything about this project. So once we've cloned it, we can clone it into the IDE. And if we just go into the chat and we say, what does the application do? Chat has no context. So it comes back and says, oh, I'm sorry, I can't really help. And actually, if you had a file open, it would use the open file for context. So it would tell you a little bit about what that file does, but it could only then infer around what the application might be. Very early yesterday morning, this slide was saying how you can use the @workspace context to go and generate a README file or generate more about an application. But as of yesterday, there's now a developer agent available for documentation. So when we run this, we can do /doc. I just then press enter. I ask it to create a README. You could ask it to update a README. And I ask it to create this documentation for the project as a whole. This goes away, generates the documentation I just accepted there. I could review the changes. And now this is the file that gets created. And you can see just how thorough it actually is. So it's gone through the project structure, how to deploy the application, how to test the application, the configuration, ways of troubleshooting, talks about the data flow, and finally talks about the main components that are incorporated in there. And that is all generated from the documentation agent in a matter of, it took maybe like 20, 30 seconds running that agent. So that sort of analyzes that code base and creates that up-to-date application for you, up-to-date README file for you. But where Workspace is really good is when you're coming along and say you've been asked to implement a feature, and because it's an unfamiliar code base, you're not entirely sure where in the project or where in the application that feature is being implemented or touched. So in this case, we're using that Workspace, and we're basically we're using QDeveloper to interrogate the application to look at, well, where are the files that interact with Bedrock? So I can send that in using Workspace. Because it's sort of indexed the files, it knows about the project structure and all of those files, and it can go away and it can tell me about all the different files that are in my application that interact with Bedrock. From the CDK stack that goes and creates the knowledge base of Bedrock, through to the Lambda functions that interact with it. And this then rapidly allows me to drill down in terms of where I need to implement the new functionality. So along with code understanding there, trying to show some examples of how you can go from code into natural language or into a textual description, I'm a real fan of visualization. So being able to visualize how an application is constructed, show the individual components, how they interact. So taking that last example, trying to get a better understanding now by asking QDeveloper, using the Workspace context, so we understand all the files in the Workspace, to generate a sequence diagram. And I wanted to generate a sequence diagram. We specify in plant UML format. So I've got installed an extension in the VS Code IDE, and to explain and look at the data flow between the front end and the back end. So I can enter that as a prompt. QDeveloper will go away, and then it generates for me a plant UML diagram format. So from here, plant UML is a .puml file or a .puml file. So I can go and open a blank file and go back to the chat window, and I can simply just go and insert the code that's been generated. And then I can go and preview that as a diagram. And obviously, I can keep that in my source code as well. So again, in a matter of 10, 20 seconds, QDeveloper has gone and generated me a sequence diagram showing not just like the flow going from the front end to the back end, identifying all the components, plus also all of the method calls. So this is a really valuable way that you can start to interrogate your code base, start creating sequence diagrams, class diagrams, different types of architectural diagrams. And then just carrying a little bit more around visualization. Again, a new project there. Yeah, so I chose a different project here because this was just, again, one of the AWS samples on GitHub. Just has a few more different AWS services. So in this case, we're going to use a service called Infrastructure Composer. It was called Application Composer up until a couple of months ago, and then it's been renamed. So Infrastructure Composer is really good in terms of being able to visualize your AWS services based from a CloudFormation template. So all I can do is right-click, open with Infrastructure Composer, and straight away, it then, with the AWS icons, shows me all of those resources that have been defined and shows me the connections between them. But obviously, often, if I wanted to include that in documentation, I'd probably have to take a snapshot. So then it's looking at different ways that you can visualize that CloudFormation template. So here again, we've got the CloudFormation template open, so that's going to be used as the input context. And we ask just to generate an architecture diagram in Mermaid format. So it's another popular diagramming format. This goes away. QDeveloper generates this architecture diagram based on the CloudFormation. Mermaid, you can just include a markdown file. So I have a markdown file where I've sort of annotated this to be a Mermaid diagram, and I just go and insert the code. And then from there, I just need to preview that markdown file. So when I come in and preview it, it's automatically generated from the CloudFormation. And this time, I actually see a bit more about that flow. So I can see how a user interacts with an Amplify front end, goes to a Lexbot, triggers a Lambda function, talks to these various DynamoDB tables. So it makes it a little bit more interactive, and it brings that application alive. I could do the same thing with Plant UML. So again, it supports multiple different diagramming formats that you can generate from a code base or from a CloudFormation template. And then the final one around visualization, this is one actually I'm personally really excited about. A lot of the time where I'm doing work now, we'll start in terms of trying to come up with a, sketch a little design because we want to understand, well, what do we need to implement? How much is it going to cost? So we sketch out design. So we actually start with a diagram. In this case, we're going to use Draw.io. So this is just, as a demo, a very simple Draw.io diagram. Draw.io, as a diagramming tool, has an XML format that underpins it. So here, in a Draw.io diagram, we defined an account with a VPC. We specified the CIDR range. We got 3 public subnets, 3 private subnets spanning across 3 AZs. And all I go and do is I go and, as I edit diagrams, so I can take the XML file that underpins it. I can then go and create, I could just paste that into a prompt, but in this case, I'll just paste that into a file so I can use that for the input context. And from there, I can go into QDeveloper. I can just say, explain the architecture of this file. So this will work with any Draw.io diagram, any Mermaid diagram, any Plant UML diagram. You can get Q to start explaining the architecture simply by analyzing a diagram that you pass it. And this goes even further now. So as well as explaining all this, I can now say generate a CloudFormation template from this diagram. And Q takes it even further and now starts generating a valid CloudFormation YAML file that I can then go and deploy directly into an account for testing. And the thing I really like about it, and I'm not sure if you can see as it starts scrolling down, is that it's even taken all the CIDR ranges and the submasks that are being applied to the different subnets. So this is, like it says here, it's created the VPC, the internet gateway, it's created all of the subnets, it's used the exact CIDR blocks that have been defined in the Draw.io diagram. So it's hugely impressive for me in terms of seeing, in terms of now how quickly you can go from an architecture diagram into working code. Next, I'm going to take a little look at the code transformation agent. Currently, this is looking at the Java 8, Java 11 to Java 17. As of yesterday, we now have a public preview for .NET, mainframe, and VMware workloads. So to do this, we've got another sample application. This was an application I helped write probably about 5 years ago. We presented it on the AWS Tech Talk. So it's a fictional bicycle license. The thing that was good about this is that it was actually written in Java 11. And I think the thing to remember, because this is, to update the application as you go from Java 11 to Java 17, you have all of these libraries and frameworks. And if you look at the more recent versions of Java, you actually then have to update all the versions of your libraries and frameworks to a version that is compliant with the latest version. So what typically happens is it becomes more and more complicated. You get this long sort of dependency chain as you struggle to try and update an application. And in the end, it effectively just sits there unpatched. And the challenge with that is it's just going to lead to vulnerabilities. So in this case, if people go and clone this, what you'll actually find is there's a CloudFormation template because it uses DynamoDB under the covers. So we want to create a DynamoDB table with a global secondary index. And there's a CloudFormation template that will do that for you. So one of the things that people don't often realize is that you can actually use Q from within the command line as well. So in this case, from the terminal within the IDE. So I don't have a great memory at the best of times. So I don't, when I'm coming up and trying to use AWS CLI and looking at, well, what's the command to do that? Normally it ends up, I'm going to open a browser window. All of a sudden you've changed your flow. It's a change of context. And you get distracted with something else that's on the internet. So this is a way that actually using Q, you can now start going from natural language to executable shell commands. So all I do is use QAI to enter it, and I enter a text saying, how do I deploy this CloudFormation template in EU West 1? Tells me what the shell command is, and it actually lets me even execute that command directly from within the terminal. By doing that, I now have my CloudFormation stack. Now that's deployed, we can just go and test it. So this is essentially just testing that we have our Java 11 application up and running. We check the launch configuration, it's Java 11. So we can go and launch it. So if people do want to play around with this, because it's a really handy little application just to go and test and understand how the code transformation agent works, we go in and we create a fictional bicycle license. So we create the license, that gets created, and then we can go and the way this works is that it's trying to show that you have a record, but we wanted to keep track of all the individual updates that have been made. So in this case, we add 3 points to the license. We can go back in, we can update it. We now say the license has 6 points. We've added another 3. Now we go and change the telephone number. And then the next example, we just remove some points. So instead of 6 points on the license, there's now 4 points on the license. So 2 points have been removed. So then when we look at the history, we can see the current states of the license, but we can also see all of the events that led up to that license being in the state that it is. So now what we want to do is run the code transformation agent. And this is a screenshot taken this morning showing exactly how it now looks in Q. So we come in, we select /transform. It detects that we have a Java 11 module. So we say we want to do that. We want to run the unit tests. Gives us a choice of running a one diff or multi-diff, which I'll touch on later. We say we just do one diff in this case. And then essentially, Amazon Q builds your project locally. So it downloads all the dependencies, it compiles it, and then it runs the unit tests. And assuming it can build that locally and everything's successful, it will then look to upload that as a build artifact. So that contains your source code, your project dependencies, your build logs. It uploads that to a secure build environment within AWS. At that point, the code transformation agent will then build that within the secure build environment in AWS, and then it will start using AI to analyze your code base. And after analyzing the code base, it comes up with this transformation plan. So this is like the initial transformation plan. These are the steps that it thinks it needs to take. So anything, new dependency versions, major code changes, suggested replacements for deprecated code. This has come up with it as the initial transformation plan. What I like as you go along is you can then see as it goes along, it then tries to update the different libraries and frameworks and compile that against Java 17. And you can see in the screenshot, as it tries to update, it fails to compile. And essentially, internally within the agent, it's actually a multi-agent system under the covers. It has a debugger. When it runs into an issue, it throws that back and uses AI to fix that error. So it then tries to keep on fixing and making changes to the code base until such times it's now compiled that as a Java 17 application. When it comes back, you can then view the diff. This is one with a single diff. If I had the multi-diff option, then essentially this will come view diff 1 of 2 or 1 of 3 or 1 of 4. So if I click into one of the files, and this is just kind of gives you an idea of how it works under the covers. So it's highlighted, it's added an entirely new method. And this is because it's a class that implements CRUD repository, which is an interface in Spring Framework. So the version of Spring Framework that's compliant with Java 17 has had a new interface method added to it, and that's essentially a breaking change. So it meant that my Java 11 code couldn't be compiled against it because it was missing this interface method. And not only has it added the method, but it's also added the implementation for it. You can then go and view the code transformation summary, and this transformation summary is slightly different than the implementation plan. So it's added some more dependencies. There were some dependencies didn't need to be upgraded. So you can view the transformation summary at the end. You can see that it ran for something like 10, 11, 12 minutes. It passed all the unit tests passed. And then I can come along and I can then test that application. So I can look and I can check that my Maven file has been updated. I can go to project structure. I use Amazon Corretto, so this is updating this to be a Java 17 version. Save that, and then I can go do a Maven clean and a Maven compile just to make sure I refresh and pick up all the latest changes that have been made to the POM XML file and bring in those dependencies. I then go to my launch configuration, and I make sure that the launch configuration is set to be Java 17 now. I can apply that, and then I can run it. So this is then launching the application as a Java 17 application. And then when that launches, we can go back in, and we can just sort of go and test that it's still a working application. And I think the thing that's most impressive to me is the fact that, you could see from the transformation summary, this ran for about 12 minutes. So in the space of 15 minutes, we've updated an entire application, including all libraries and frameworks from Java 11 to Java 17. We've fixed all the compilation errors that occurred, and we now have a running application in Java 17. So it's really impressive. One thing, it's a little bit sort of trying to shoehorn it in here. Yesterday, there was the announcement in terms of a new Q developer agent for unit tests, or for tests, in terms of creating unit tests. Currently supports Java and Python. I imagine other languages are going to be a fast follow. So I thought I'd actually show how this would work using, because this is a Java application. So the way that the agent works for unit tests is when you run it, it will use the current active file that's open in the IDE. So you have an option in terms of selecting a function within that file, or in my case now, when I do test/test, I just press enter, and then this will go away, and it will generate unit tests for all of those methods, all of the functions that are within this class. So like I say, this is now available. I can go and view the diff. I was absolutely blown away in terms of, the number of unit tests, the sheer length of that, the quality of it. So that's all been created. I can go and accept that. And then I have the unit tests that have been created. So now it's, it's a much better, richer way of creating unit tests than if you were trying to use the chat window to generate unit tests. And then finally touching on here around vulnerability scanning, because I think it's a common complaint or a common concern that people have. So when you're using generative AI and generating non-deterministic code that comes out the back of it, how do we know that it's not riddled with vulnerabilities? So the great thing about Q Developer is it actually comes with code scanning and security scanning built into it. So here in the screenshot, you can see that it does automatic reviews, or you can pause that and run a full project scan. So when it's doing that, I have the automatic reviews set up by default, and that essentially means that every single time I make a change to a file and I save that file, there's a scan that gets run against that. And effectively uses Code Guru Detector Library under the covers to test for that. So this essentially looks for three things. So the first thing is it runs SAST, so static application security testing. So this looks for things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection by running static analysis against the source code. It then looks for secrets detection. So it tries to see if you've checked in any secret access keys, anything that's been hard-coded into the code base. And finally does infrastructure as code scanning. So this will scan things like CloudFormation templates, Terraform, CDK. So it will scan those looking for either misconfigurations or also for areas that it doesn't conform to AWS best practice. And as part of that, you can do that full project review. So another new agent that got released yesterday was the one that was looking to do, find and fix issues within your project. And ran this morning so that we could talk about it. Don't pass any judgment around the quality of the code that was written. It was written 4 or 5 years ago. So I can simply go and do /review, and then I can select whether I want to review the current file or the whole project. In this case, I want to review the whole project. This goes away, initiates the code review, comes back, and I'm proud to say it didn't find any critical errors, and there were only 18 or 19 high errors. But once it's found that, that's only the start of it. So what we can do then is we can go and click on every single finding, and on the right-hand side, it gives you the fix that you can then go and apply. So that was because it was CloudFormation. Here, there's some code. We can generate a fix. This will then generate a diff that you can look at to see if you want to choose to accept, or you could ignore it and go into the code. But that way, then, it gives you this automatic way of carrying out, doing a full project scan, analyzing your code, identifying issues, and it will give you links to things like CWE and the vulnerabilities, and then it will generate fixes for how you can fix that code and allow you to automatically apply that to your code base. So incredibly powerful. And then we come on to code generation. So again, code generation is probably what most people think of when we talk about code assistance. And the first thing is touching on the importance of the prompt. So here, we ask the chat window in Q Developer to generate a Python function, take in 2 numbers, return the sum of it. As you can see, it comes back, it generates nicely commented code, And then it starts going through, giving the details in terms of the code that it's generated, how to run it. And it was actually speaking to a number of friends and colleagues, and some of them, if they were, for example, in this case, experts in Python programming, they found it quite frustrating that it was sort of like you enter, you just want to know what the code is, you want to know what function is that I need to call. And all of a sudden you're sitting there as it's quite verbose in terms of going through that. So I was trying to say, well, how can you change that? So this is quite an interesting one. So how different do you think this will look if I run the same prompt and just put the words with no explanation at the end of it? So I run that, and all that gets returned is 2 lines of code. So you can see the vast difference that changes just by changing the prompt, and in this case, adding a couple of lines of code. So then you get down to, is there a way of customizing QDeveloper based upon your individual preferences? So it's a little bit of a hack, but there is a way that you can do this. So essentially, using the workspace context, you can reference individual files. So we create, in this case, we say we want to generate node codes. We basically create a personalization file in a markdown file called node.js, and in it, I'm very specific, saying, only provide Node.js code unless it explicitly states otherwise. Always use the AWS SDK version 3. In this case, I want detailed explanations. And then you can see if I pass a prompt in and I reference that markdown file using the workspace context, I can ask a question like, how do I upload a file to S3? This comes back, and you can see at the beginning where it's saying it's using Node.js, it's using AWS SDK version 3, and it's providing a detailed explanation. So you can see how it's basically taken the information that's passed in the markdown file and used that as the input context. So you can then start generating code and asking it for advice that is then personalized to to the level of detail that you want to see in the output. And finally, we're going to go through some examples of running some demos. So a lot of things that I do in my role now ends up being trying to write little proof of concepts. So a lot of it comes along in terms of trying to prove the viability, do these services interact together? And I'm very much a believer in show, not tell. So instead of trying to draw out a diagram, write a lengthy explanation, hand it to someone, I'd far rather be able to say, this is how I think it works, this is some running code that you can look at. So in this case, set myself a goal of trying to build a front end and a back end. The front end, a web page that takes in a URL from an article from the Amazon Builders library, posts that URL to an API. That API then calls out to a Lambda function that goes and scrapes that data, throws it into a foundation model hosted by Bedrock, summarizes it, and then returns it back to be rendered on the front end. So in this case, we're going to use Infrastructure Composer, and Infrastructure Composer generates valid AWS SAM template, so serverless application model. So I know if I'm starting off with the back end, I want to build an API gateway and a Lambda function. I'm trying to find a simple way of doing that that conforms to AWS best practice. So I can go and create an empty file, so just a template YAML file. That's going to be my CloudFormation file. Right-click, open with Infrastructure Composer. This then opens this palette in the visual editor, and I can drag and drop an API gateway component across. I can go and change that because I know that I want to make a post, so I can update that to be a post method. And then I know that I need to enable cores. So I can just go in, it's a prototype, I can just go and allow all origins, I can allow the content type header, and I say that I want to allow the post method as well. So I can go and set that up using Infrastructure Composer. I can go and save that, and then I know I want the API gateway to be calling a Lambda function. So I can drag and drop a Lambda function across. I can go in, I can change the logical ID of it that will be referenced back in the CloudFormation template. If I wanted to, I could change the runtime. If I was doing it today, you could even go up to node 22. I can save that function, and then the great thing about Infrastructure Composer is I can go and draw a connection between them. And that automatically sets up the Lambda proxy integration from API gateway to the Lambda function. So I can then go and look back in the template YAML file, and I can kind of see, here's my Lambda function defined, and it's triggered by a post from the API gateway. The next thing then is to put the business logic into that. So this is using the developer agent, and actually it's quite a lengthy prompt that you end up passing in. I tend to sort of break things down into two sections. So the first section is asking for the business logic that you wanted to implement. So I know, accept an HTTP post, that takes in a URL. I want you to go and scrape that URL, extract the data, call Bedrock. So all of that business logic. And then at the bottom, I kind of instruct it in terms of, I want to make sure I have a README file, a license file. I want to make sure you include any dependencies in my package JSON file, include comments, include unit tests. So I can then go and pass that in using the developer agent. So this then runs, and the way the developer agent works, it takes in your prompt, then it starts analyzing all the files in your code base, and then starts determining what changes need to be made. And as it goes through, again, because it's an agentic system, it comes up with these steps of changes. You can actually see it going through. It goes through step 2, then step 3, then step 4. And after each step, it reevaluates where it is. So you can see at the end of step 4 here, it knows, well, my next step, I still need to add unit tests. I still need to ensure all the documentation is complete. So it goes through that step by step by step. It can reevaluate. And at the end, it comes up, and you can view all the changes to files, and the new files have been created. And you can either choose to accept that, or if you want to change some of that code, you can go and click the button to provide the feedback, and then it will regenerate that code. So I've now accepted that, so the plan then is to try and deploy it. Because we used Infrastructure Composer and it supports AWS SAM, I can simply go ahead and run SAM deploy. So I do SAM deploy using the guided attribute and referencing the template YAML file. This goes ahead, and all I need to do is set a stack name. So this will be the CloudFormation stack name, specify the region that I want this to be deployed into, and there's a whole number of defaults that go through. This deploys the code. The stack has now been deployed, but the problem is I actually don't know the URL that I need to test it. So I can go back into the template YAML file. I can use the inline chat, and I can simply go output the API endpoint. Q comes up in the inline chat. It generates that as a diff. I can go and accept that as a diff in the CloudFormation file, go and redeploy it. When it comes back, I can now see the URL for the API endpoint that I can then run a curl command against. So now it's time to start trying to test. And the first thing that happens, I run a curl command, and I get sort of, there's an internal error, there's a problem here. So now I have these options in terms of I can go away, and I can go into the AWS console, start going through log groups, start trying to search through CloudWatch to try and detect the problem is. But I thought I'd just go into Q and start going, is there a way I can retain in the ID and still do that? So I'm basically asking Q here in terms of, is there a way that I can tail logs using AWS SAM? And it tells me I can use a SAM log CLI command. It gives me the command to run, so I can go and execute that. So execute that command, and then this will come up and show me, it will tail the end of the log group for that particular Lambda function. And when I scroll up, it's quite obvious in terms of what the actual error is. So it tells me there's an access denied exception, and I'm not authorized to perform Bedrock invoke model. So again, this is where we're sort of saying that it's non-deterministic, it's not guaranteed it's going to generate perfect code every single time. So being able to debug that code and fix errors is critical. But all I need to do here, because I know the permissions are applied in the template YAML file, I just select the error message from the logs. I then go and select the summary function where it's been defined as a resource. Again, Command-I, open the inline chat. And I can just go and say, fix this error. Make sure that I have permission to call Bedrock invoke model. And the way I tend to work is then just paste that error message in. This goes away, and it will then generate the diff. So it's added now a policy to allow the Bedrock invoke model on a particular foundation model. I can then choose to accept that, deploy it. So I do that, deploy it. This time when it comes back, there's another error message in the log. And the error message was saying it's a validation error, something to do with the way that I'm trying to call out to Bedrock. So again, it's the same kind of process. It's literally just going in, it's selecting the Lambda function. I select the code that I know I'm calling out. I go into the inline chat, and I just basically say, fix this error, and then paste in the error message from the logs. Q can then go away, and it generates the diff again, so I can go and accept that. This gets me one stage further. but I'm still sort of seeing a couple of error messages in the response. So now I suddenly realize I actually need to capture some more log statements. And this is quite neat. I basically just select the whole of the Lambda function, and I just say, instrument this function with some log statements. So I can add logging to it, and I want to make sure that one of the things that I log is the response that's coming back. So this goes ahead, generates the diff. I mean, obviously, if I was doing this normally, I'd use things like Lambda Power Tools or some kind of logging library. At the moment, it's just a prototype, so just using some console log statements. That comes back, and then when I run the curl command again, I can actually see I do get the response back from Bedrock. There's a problem in terms of how I'm actually returning it. So what I need to do now is I select that whole of the JSON message that's being returned from Bedrock. I go into the code. I know there's a problem with my return statement. So again, I just select that snippet of code, go into the inline chat, and it really is as simple as now saying, well, I just want to return the text attribute from this JSON message. So I can start chatting to the code, asking it to fix the little errors and bugs that are still inherent in the code base. It goes away, fixes that code. I can go ahead and I go and accept that change, and then I can go away and I can go and do save that. I can go another SAM deploy, and then when I test it this time, it comes back, and I now have a fully working back-end API. The challenge now is trying to build a front end, and I'm not a front-end engineer. It's one of those things that sort of scares me, so I'm trying to work out, right, how am I actually going to build a front end? So I go in and try to work out where to start. So again, I start just with the chat and asking basic questions. So, what's the most popular JavaScript framework on AWS? So I want to try and build a web front end. Comes back and it gives me these options. So there's things like Angular, Vue, and Next.js. And it literally was as random as the very first one that came back. It says React. Then I say, OK, well, I'll try and build a React UI. So what's the simplest way, what's the easiest way to create a React web application? And now it comes back and it tells me how I can use some of these commands, like create React app, and that will essentially bootstrap and create a starter project for me with all the packages and dependencies that I need. So I can go ahead and I can go and run that command, specify a project that I want to do with that. And now I can go and install all those packages, install the dependencies, and I can have a sort of a React front end up and running. So I can go into the project that's just been created, and I can go and run npm start, and that will start my development server. So that's great. And also I now have a React front end, which is brilliant, but obviously it doesn't have the look and feel that I really want. So the next thing then is to go into the developer agent. And it's a similar kind of prompt. There's sort of two parts to it. So the first part, giving the instructions that I want a home page with a text field that I can paste a URL in, a button called summarize that I can click, and it's going to target the endpoint. And then when it gets the response back, I want to display that below. And then again, the project requirements. Make sure you update the README. Make sure you update the dependencies, the package JSON file. Make sure you include unit tests. So I go ahead and I run that, and you see these like summary of changes coming back. This time I can see there isn't a change. Well, this time it's updated to the README, so I can go in. Tells me I need to install dependencies, and then I can just run npm start again. So I go and do npm install or npm I, install the dependencies, run npm start the development server. So that launches, and then it refreshes the application. And then this is what it gives me. So at least now I have a fully working web front end. And I'm looking at it, I'm kind of going, it's probably not the look and feel that I sort of want. So I thought I'd give it one more try now, going in, using the developer agent, and actually using it this time to try and do a little bit of styling. I mean, I don't know anything around CSS and style sheets and what to do, so I just basically say to it, well, can you make the text box wider? Can you make I want margins around the side. I don't want it so spread out. But I also want additional functionality. So I want a clear button now, because I wasn't sure how I was going to clear that response. So again, I pass that in. I run that as a prompt. And I can see then Q starts analyzing, works out in terms of these are the open files. What files do I need to go and change now? It detects that it needs to make some changes to the style sheet, to the CSS file and the front end. And then as it goes through step by step, and then it reaches a point where it feels that it's met all the requirements. And at that point, it will give me the list of files that are changed. So I can see it's made some changes to styling, to the app.js. So I can simply go and save that. I don't need to install any new dependencies because it hasn't come in, so I can just run npm start again. And then this time, this will refresh, and all of a sudden it's something that's a lot nicer looking. So again, I can go in and enter the URL for an article, I can click summarize. This will go away, and now it will display that, a 200-word summary of an article below that. I can go in and click clear. But it also means now I have a little bit more confidence. So if I want to do things like add a logo, if I want to change the colors, if I want to do something else, rather than me having to learn CSS, I could use QDeveloper and start using that to try and customize and tailor that front end. And then the final example I wanted to show, because the one thing as I was going through these examples, looking at ways of doing it, is, it was kind of nice doing the personalization file for me as an individual engineer. And then I was trying to work out, well, what happens when I'm working and I'm an engineering lead of a squad? I don't really want everyone to be having to pass in such a long prompt saying, always update unit tests, always update the README, always add comments, and so on. So I was trying to go, is there a way of creating like a prompt template that you could use using QDeveloper? So this has then got me looking at in terms of like, well, can I actually specify all of this within a requirements file? So I basically created a requirements markdown file. I added all of that in there. And then all I could do now when I do my prompt with the developer agent is, in this case, kind of like the business logic I want. So I wanted to go and create an entire AWS CDK implementation, including all code, to meet the requirements as set out in my requirements markdown file. And that requirements markdown file also includes a mermaid diagram to show the application that I want it to go and create. That goes away. You can see it goes through all of these summary of changes. It then creates the entire file structure, all of these new files that I simply just go and accept. Then it comes back, and I thought I'd try and run it. So there is things that isn't quite right. So it didn't tell me, I knew I wanted to try and do a CDK synth first. So I do a CDK synth. Then I can go in, and bootstrap an account. So I can go and do CDK bootstrap and a temporary AWS account I set up for this. And then I can go a CDK deploy. So I do a CDK deploy, that goes and deploys that. There are no issues in terms of deploying it. It deploys the whole stack. So then I can go and I can clear it, and I can start trying to do some testing on it just to see if it works. So in this case, I tried to do a curl command. It did come up initially with a permissions error, but I knew, again, like we did in the template YAML file, this is going to be defined in the Python file that defines the CDK stack. So I can open that file. Something as very simple as just selecting all the code, going into the inline chat, and saying, fix this error. And the thing that was great about that is QDeveloper was actually clever enough in the inline chat to recognize that actually it needs to update those permissions for all of the Lambda functions. So it's gone and generated that as a diff. I choose to accept it. Once I accept it, I can then go in and I can do another CDK deploy. So clear the screen, run a CDK deploy, and this will then go and deploy the new changes with the new permissions applied to the Lambda functions. And then from here, I can run a curl command. And this time now, I have an item that's been written to DynamoDB. And then from here, I can take that item ID. I can then go and do a GET request with the item ID to see if I can retrieve it, which works. So that was the thing that I was blown away by. So in terms of all I'm using now in terms of bootstrapping that project is a requirements file and an architecture diagram. I wrote a blog post the other week doing pretty much exactly the same process, but using Terraform. So all of a sudden you see how powerful this is in terms of generating infrastructure as code, being able to create automated deployments using CDK, using Terraform, using CloudFormation. So in terms of finishing up, the number of useful resources. So there is a changelog for Amazon QDeveloper. It's probably been pretty busy over these last few days. There's also a set of tips that are available from Nathan, who's the senior developer advocate. Some interesting blog posts that Massimo has written, including the one around the DIY personalization. And there's an AWS community builder, Christian, and he keeps a curated list of all the articles and all the tips and tricks that people have been created around Amazon Q Developer, and it's useful to keep an eye on that. And then finally, these are my sort of key takeaways. So the first thing, explore capabilities. So don't just use it, just think of Amazon Q Developer as a way of generating code. We now have all of these 5 agents. So generating unit tests, generating documentation. I think it's really powerful generating architecture diagrams and the visualizations, and also using diagrams to generate infrastructure as code from there. Use it just to ask basic architectural questions. What is the right way of doing this? What are the AWS services that do that? What is the AWS best practice? And then when it does come to code generation, the prompt engineering is critical. So that's something that's worth playing around with. And for me, I can kind of see the future as a way where you can start creating these prompt templates. So therefore, you can come along. If you have to create a new project, you can bootstrap it with a prompt template, and you then get that sort of consistency in terms of the code that gets generated. And then more importantly, as I said right at the outset, all of these things that we've shown today, all of the 5 agents, the different tips and tricks and so on, all of that is available for you to try for free by signing up with an Amazon Builder ID for Q Developer. So go build. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for giving up your time coming here. I hope you enjoyed, and enjoy the rest of reInvent.